react to what happened in Buffalo yesterday. A terrible.
Can't hear you.
I have to respond to what happened yesterday in Buffalo. Is the loudspeaker on? Working? People can't hear me.
It's fine.
Oh, okay. Let me start again. I feel I have to give some type of reaction to what happened yesterday, the terrible criminal act of mass murder directed against a minority. And we have to respond to it as Jews. Everything has to go through the prism of our Jewish identity. Number one, it goes without saying, but sometimes we have to say things that go without saying. It's the most abhorrent type of behavior that has no basis and justification in a civilized world. It's the very antithesis of why God created this world and put human beings on this earth. And he gave all of humanity, not just the Jews, 7 Noahide commandments, one of which is not to commit murder. People who believe in murder don't have a justification to exist. These people are, I don't want to call them animals, because animals are harmless, are guiltless, but there is no word to describe how evil this act was, and I hope that he gets the ultimate punishment, if it's possible. This is one case where, although I'm pretty skeptical about the death penalty in this country because so many people are convicted based on circumstantial evidence, and I don't think anyone should ever get the ultimate punishment based on circumstantial evidence when there's so many questions about the person's real guilt. But in this case, there's no question about his guilt. There were so many witnesses to it. This person deserves the death penalty.
Put it on the internet.
Right, but whatever he did, whether he did it in private or in public, he is the ultimate source of evil. So there's no question that we feel the pain of the black minority because we have gone through this throughout our long history. And as it says in the Torah that we have to be very sympathetic to all those who suffer because we suffered in the land of Egypt. That's point number one, which shouldn't even have to be stated. But in today's world, if you don't state something, you're accused of agreeing with what's going on. That's part of the sickness of today's society. But I think as Jews, we have to recognize that we are just as much targets of these evil people. This murderer was just as much filled with hatred towards Jews as he was towards blacks. So we have to be vigilant, of course, and we have to do whatever we can do to protect ourselves, which is not an easy task. You see, this guy, there was a guard who shot at him and hit him a few times, and it didn't help. So if these people want to prepare for what they're doing, they can protect themselves, and the guard himself was tragically murdered. So we can't just rely on security, although we need to have security. We can't just rely on security. There's a bigger problem in society than what I say this over and over again, but I hope it registers with some people. But before I go into that, I just want to mention that everyone now is focused on white supremacists, and they are evil, patently, thoroughly, comprehensively, whatever word I can find, whatever adjectives, they are the nadir of evil. But they're not the only sources of anti-Semitism. And because of the political atmosphere in this country, people are overlooking the anti-Semitism that's coming from the left, that's coming from the Arabs, that's coming from every imaginable source. So in that sense, the Jewish people are in a more vulnerable position because We're hated by both sides. The anti-Semitism in this country is the largest, the highest number of hate crimes are against Jews, and they come from every race. We are much more sympathetic to the cause of the black minority than they are to our cause, because there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in that community. So there's no question that we have to be vigilant because it's coming from all directions, and we have to prepare ourselves to fight every place where this hatred comes from. As far as how do we stop this, and I said this many times, and I'll repeat myself as many times as I have to, the solution is not what the political people just, it's a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, there's a murder with a gun, we have to get rid of guns, as if this guy couldn't get a hold of guns if we had laws that banned all guns. These are criminals, these are not law-abiding citizens. Yes, maybe there's a benefit to reducing the number of guns in this country, but that's not the solution to the problem. Neither is the solution longer prison terms. Maybe that will deter some people, but that's not a solution. The solution is people, and I'm just shocked that people don't ask themselves the question, why does a human being decide to murder another human being? Where did he get that from? The answer is he got it from his education. So what's wrong in our country is we don't have an educational system. We have a system that tries to teach you some basics, then they try to indoctrinate you with every new fad that comes along, but they don't teach you morality. Because morality is religion, and we can't have religion in our public schools. So we're going to keep on having children growing up that have no values, no ethics, no morality. And don't be surprised when they go out and they kill people. Why not? Some of them have no purpose in life. So if you have no purpose in life, you can do whatever you want and get killed, or killed doesn't mean anything. And for some people, the purpose in life is to hate others. We need to educate ourselves, starting with ourselves, and then educate the young generation and fight for returning morality to the educational system. I can go on, but of course this is not the time and place for it. I just also want to mention the opposite side of things, that today is a holiday. Today is Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. If you see there's some matzah on the table, so it's a custom to eat matzah today. Why is there a second Passover? Because in the times of the Exodus, when the Jewish people were celebrating their first anniversary of Passover, there were a group of Jews who were told they cannot be participants in that ritual because they were ritually unclean. They had come in contact with a corpse. And they complained, why should we be denied that opportunity to do this mitzvah? And God, after Moses consulted with God, responded that they indeed will have another opportunity a month later. And the very powerful message here is that it's a good thing to complain when you're denied an opportunity to become more Jewish, to do some things that are more, bring you closer to God. Yes, complain about it. And the second lesson is that it's never too late. You could always make up. You can be 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. It's never too late to turn your life around. And that's a lesson that we all have to take and apply it to ourselves. So let's now start with, if anyone has any questions on what I just said and wants to add something, leave it for after the end of the class.
What about, though, talking about what you're going to do to make this place safe?
The question is, well, how are we going to make this place safe? We're going to try to get security when we have larger amounts of numbers of people here. It's very expensive, so of course we're going to have to do some fundraising for that. But that's
other things we can do.
Yeah, there are other things. We do consult with the Amherst police, and they give us some ideas. So we're going to redo that. Reconnect. Okay. Well, we're going to try to explore, is Judaism today the same as the Judaism of Moses? 3,300 years ago. Let's put it this way. If Moses would show up, he would walk into this room and look at us. Would he recognize us? Well, our clothing has changed somewhat. But when we start talking, assuming that he understands English or he has an interpreter, and we talk about Judaism, will he recognize the Judaism that is practiced today? So that's what we're going to find out as we go through this class. I'm not going to give you the answer right now, keep you in suspense. So that leads us to the basic question, how did Judaism begin and how did it evolve, if indeed it did evolve? And if it did evolve, how did it change? What brought about change? Most people believe that everything in the world is in the state of evolving, and what changes things are circumstances of people's lives that require change of attitudes. Just to give you an example, the current controversy about abortion, what precipitated this whole controversy? It's because people had a more liberal sexual attitude, and therefore there were unwanted pregnancies, so there has to be a way of dealing with it. So it forced society to confront this issue of abortion. That's just one example. So sometimes it's worldly circumstances that change the way we think about things. Is that true about Judaism? Did Judaism change because it has to contend with new circumstances, with new fads, with new ideas? Or is there some organic aspect of Judaism that allows it to change, if indeed it does change? That's what we're going to try to explore as well. And also we want to explore what makes Judaism unique. There are recorded 15,000 religions, and they all claim to have the truth. So how do we know that we have the truth? What's the basis for our claim to truth? That's something that we have to explore. And when we talk about Judaism, Judaism is synonymous with Torah. So that's what we're going to explore. What exactly is Torah? And just to end with this introduction with one quote from Rabbi Saadia Gaon. Rabbi Saadia Gaon was the Maimonides before Maimonides. Maimonides lived in the 12th century. He lived in the 10th century. And he was known as the greatest authority of Jewish law of his time, a Talmudist. He was also a brilliant philosopher. He was the greatest Jewish philosopher up until Maimonides, and a great Jewish leader. So he writes, our nation is only a nation because of its Torah. Our nation is only here because of its Torah. So that's the premise that this class is based on, that if we wouldn't have the Torah, whatever that means, whatever Torah means, which we'll go into, we wouldn't be here as a nation. Someone just mentioned to me this morning that a certain radio personality of a talk show, a little bit crazy, I think, maybe a lot crazy, was laughing, mocking Jewish person who celebrates Purim. Says, why are you celebrating this antiquated holiday, this ancient 2,000-year-old holiday? You have to focus on what's going on in the world today. And the response to that very misguided comment came from a Jewish personality. I don't want to mention his name. But what he didn't realize is that if we didn't celebrate Purim today, if we didn't celebrate Passover or any of the other Jewish holidays, we wouldn't be here today. There'd be no such thing as a Jewish people. The whole thing would be moot. We're only here today because of our Torah, because of our Judaism. So let's explore this. What do we mean when we say the word Torah? Let's translate first. Torah is something that everyone knows, heard of the Torah. What exactly does the word Torah mean? Does it mean, this is a test, multiple choice. Does it mean law, knowledge, instruction, or truth?
It's all of them.
It may be all, but what does it mean? If you have to translate it.
Law.
You say law. Okay? No, it doesn't mean law. Knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge in Torah, but it doesn't mean knowledge. And it doesn't mean truth. It means instruction or guidance. The root of the word Torah means to show you the way. Of course, it involves laws. Torah is filled with laws, but the word Torah means showing the way, instructing us, guiding us, directing us. You're on a journey and you're lost, and you ask directions. That person is giving you Torah, he's giving you direction. Well, the Torah gives us direction because life is a very confusing place to be in. It beats the alternative, of course, but life is something that is confusing, it's chaotic, and nobody knows why they're here, where they're going, why they're going, and the Torah guides you and tells you how to live your life and how to go in the right direction. In Aramaic, which is another Jewish language, see, Jews always have two languages at least. They speak or they study in Hebrew, the Holy Tongue, but they also have an exile language. And in ancient times, it was Aramaic. Some of the Bible is written in Aramaic. How many here knew that? Okay. The book of Daniel, among other books, part of it is written in Aramaic. That was the language of the Jewish people in Babylonian exile. And that's the language of the Talmud. That's the language of the Zohar, the principal work of mysticism. And Jews spoke Aramaic for centuries. It's like Yiddish. Yiddish is a Jewish language, but it's not the Hebrew. We have a lot of Hebrew words in Yiddish, but it's a language that Jews use to converse in. Sephardic Jews have their own type of Yiddish called Ladino. There's a Judaic Arabic, and there's a Judaic Persian, Farsi. There's Jews always had, they reserved the Holy Tongue mostly for study, for spiritual, for prayer, but they conversed in other languages, in other Jewish languages. So Aramaic word for Torah is oraita. Or, you know, what does the word or mean?
Light.
Or is light. Oraita means bringing light. So what does the function of light? What does light do? The lights are off and someone switches it on. What changed in terms of our presence in this room before we turned the light on and after we turned the light on? What changed? We could see. It exposes the truth. It exposes what's really going on. If it's dark, we don't know what's going on. It clarifies light. The Torah as light clarifies our purpose. We can be in a place, you don't know why you're going, where you're going, and it guides us in the right direction. So that's what Torah is all about. Torah is guidance, instruction, direction, and it's based on the fact that it introduces light into the world. Without Torah, we would live in a very dark world. So let's talk about the definition of Torah. When we speak about Torah, what precisely do we mean when we say the word Torah? So I put over here, there was two definitions. There's a narrow definition and a broad definition. And they're both very important to remember. The narrow definition of Torah are the 5 books of Moses. If we open the Ark, you would see a Torah scroll. What does that Torah scroll contain? 5 books of Moses, and that's it. Not another letter. If you add other letters to it, it would invalidate it. You couldn't use it. It's only the 5 books of Moses. Why the 5 books of Moses? Because the basis of Judaism, everything that there is in Judaism, has to be ultimately traced back and based on the 5 books of Moses. Because the 5 books of Moses represents the transmission of laws and direction from God to Moses in a very, very precise manner. Every word, every letter was dictated by God to Moses, and therefore the Torah scroll has the most authentic communication of the divine to humanity. And everything in Judaism ultimately traces itself back to the 5 books of Moses. But that's when we use the word Torah in a narrow sense. When we use Torah in a broad sense, it involves, it comprises all of Jewish knowledge, and I put a list of different subjects. It includes, of course, all of the biblical literature, because the Bible, the Jewish Bible, is not just the 5 books of Moses. It's called Tanakh. What does Tanakh stand for? Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. So when we talk about Torah, in a broader sense, it means all of the biblical literature. All the prophets, book of Isaiah, for example, Jeremiah, and all the other writings, the book of Psalms, the book of Job, the book of Proverbs, they are all considered to be part of what we call Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And that has a special status, and we lump them all together and refer to them as the written Torah, because these are books that were told that God communicated to Moses and then later on to other prophets, and asked them to submit it in writing, to put it in writing. So there's a body of Jewish knowledge that was communicated by God through Moses and other prophets and put into writing. That's Tanakh. But then Torah also incorporates all of Jewish law that we have in the Mishnah and the Talmud and all the other books that are based on Jewish law. Then we have Jewish ethics. What's the difference between ethics and law? The difference is that it may be illegal to steal in this country. It's not illegal to lie unless you're on the witness stand. But it's considered unethical. In Judaism, it's illegal. But there are differences between something that's illegal or unethical. You could sometimes get away with certain practices because they're not illegal, but they'll still ostracize you because what you did was unethical. So Judaism has its own system of what's legal or illegal and what's ethical or unethical. That's all part of Torah. There's a separate part of the Mishnah called Ethics of the Fathers that focuses on ethics. And that's just one of many different texts. Then there's Jewish philosophy. Maimonides wrote a book called Guide for the Perplexed. That is part of Torah. And later on I'll explain how it gets to be part of Torah. Let's say someone comes up with a nice idea in this class and to explain a certain tradition of Judaism, and no one else in history ever gave that explanation. You were creative. That is also part of Torah. It's all an extension from, based on, it revolves around the teachings of Torah that were transmitted at Mount Sinai. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, the mystical teachings of Judaism, they were also considered to be part of Torah. Jewish history, Judaism puts a great emphasis on knowing our history. That's also part of Torah. And I threw in another one, numerology, which means sometimes we look at a word and we translate the word, but sometimes we look at the numbers, because every word is also a number. In English, you don't really have that as in the same way we have it in Hebrew. In English, if I say a word table, we don't add up the T is, what letter is T of the alphabet? And the A is 1, and I'm not going to try to count what T is. B is 2, L is whatever it is, and E is 5. That's as far as I can go. So the word table has a numerical value. It doesn't mean anything, but in Hebrew, every word has a numerical value. And therefore, you could interpret words based on the numerical value. When you find two words that have the same numerical value, one sheds light on the other. So all these are part of Torah. Okay, so what's the source of Torah? Where does Torah come from? So the basic understanding amongst Jews for millennia is that Torah is divine knowledge. It's God's knowledge. And God created the world, so he preceded creation. There's God, and then there's creation. So if God's wisdom is Torah, Torah itself preceded creation of the world. God's mind, God's ideas were here before he created the world. Torah, in other words, transcends creation. If people will ask, well, when was the Torah made up? When was it composed? The answer is it was always here. It never non-existed, because it's divine, and anything that's divine, by definition, always existed. The basic belief of Judaism, which summed up in the very first word of the Torah, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. That means that there is a creation. The Greek philosophers didn't believe in creation. They believed that the universe always existed, just like God always existed. Maimonides goes to great lengths in his Guide for the Perplexed to show that there's no basis for that. That we take the Torah's words literally, that God existed, always existed, and created the universe. So the Torah, which is God's wisdom, also always existed. Then we're told another thing. The Torah was also the blueprint of creation. When God created the universe, just like any person who wants to build something will consult an architect who will draw blueprints, and based on the blueprints, the structure will be built, God also used the Torah as his blueprint for creation. So the whole world that we reside in, this whole universe, not just the physical world that we know of, but the whole universe was created through the blueprint which is called Torah. Then God took the Torah, this knowledge that transcends creation, this knowledge that was the blueprint of creation, and he says, I'm giving it to mortals at Mount Sinai in the year 2448 after creation. And he says, this divine wisdom is going to be your constitution. This is what's going to guide your lives and give you a purpose, revealing to you what is the reason for your existence and how you fulfill your purpose. So Torah, to summarize, Torah exists on many planes. Torah precedes creation, Torah is the instrument of creation, and Torah is the guide for us in our existence in this world. So Torah appears in several different locations, you could say. Beyond the world, source of the existence of the world, and the instruction how we live our lives in this world. When does this Torah, when was it fully revealed to the world? It happened at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is, without any question, the world's most historical event. There is no other event in all of human history, in all of history, period, that can come close to Mount Sinai, what happened at Mount Sinai. It was the only time in all of human history where God reveals himself to the entire Jewish people and gives them the basis for all of Judaism in the so-called 10 Commandments. And it's something that we're obligated to remember every day. There are 6 things we're commanded to remember every day. One of them is the Exodus, and another one of them is the revelation of God at Mount Sinai. And I want to just digress for a few moments. We see people get very upset, justifiably so, when we hear of anti-Semites denying the Holocaust. Holocaust denial. Why is it so painful to us because they deny the Holocaust? I'd be happy that they were right, that there was no Holocaust. So why are we so upset when they deny it? Because that's part of who we are. It defines our existence. Also, it means that they're trying to hide the fact that we're victims, that we're persecuted, so they can persecute us, because it'll be the first time they're doing it. Whatever reasons, people who deny the Holocaust, which is evil, gets us really upset. It really riles us. It really makes people upset. But you know what? It pales in comparison to denial of what happened at Mount Sinai. What happened at Mount Sinai, if one denies, then there's no Judaism. The whole concept of Judaism doesn't exist. There is no Jewish people. There's nothing. To deny the Holocaust doesn't deny our existence. If there would be no Holocaust, it wouldn't make us less of a nation. And yet we get so upset by it. If you deny what happened at Mount Sinai, then we're not part of the chosen people. God did not give us a teaching, a Torah. It's all man-made. And if it was all man-made, then it wouldn't have lasted more than 100 years, or even less than that. The fact that Torah was given at Mount Sinai, that's the basis for our existence. That defines us who we are. You deny Sinai, you could deny everything about the Jewish people, and there is no Jewish people, and there is no purpose in life as well. The Talmud says that when the God created the world trembled, because the world did not know how long it will survive. Because if no one would accept the Torah, the Talmud tells us, then the world would revert to nothingness. So when God comes to the different nations of the world, the Talmud reports, and asks them if they want to accept the Torah, they all said no. Thank you, but no thank you. We don't want the Torah. So the world was waiting with bated breath. Will somebody accept the Torah and give the world a purpose to exist? It's very validation. And the Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we'll hear what it's about. And God said, okay, the world will exist. And the world took a sigh of relief, because it didn't have any future without us accepting the Torah. So not only does the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai validate our existence, it validates the whole universe. The whole universe was waiting for the event at Mount Sinai. And here's a very powerful point that's made in the Torah itself, in the book of Deuteronomy. There's no religion that makes the same claim as Judaism. What is our claim? That there was a nation of 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. So how many women? Let's say the equal amount of women. Then how many children under 20 and how many elders over 60? And then there were a lot of adherents, people who came from other nations that joined the Jewish people. So you had between 2 and 3 million people. And God revealed himself to every single one of them. And they all had the same experience. Every religion is based on God, the claim that God came to one person and said, I am choosing you as my prophet. And that one person had a few people that he influenced, and then they added a few more people until it grows into a religion. You can have 1 billion people or more, 2 billion. There are 2 religions combined to have about 2 to 3 billion people. If you trace it all the way back, what is it based on? On one person. In the case of the Muslims, they go back to Muhammad. How do we know Muhammad was a prophet? He said so. Okay, I can tell you the same thing. I want you to know that I'm a prophet, and I want you to empty out your bank accounts, because God sent me to tell you. You know, anyone could do that, and if you're charismatic enough and you have a few people that really believe you, and if you have a certain charm, you'll get several adherents, and then it'll spread, and a religion could grow out of it, and you can have millions, if not billions, of people following you. No other religion makes a claim that God revealed himself to everybody, men, women, and children, young and old, people from different backgrounds. And if anyone would want to make up a religion, let's say I want to make up a religion today, and I say, you know what? God revealed himself to your ancestors 100 years ago, and everyone was there at Mount Sinai, not at Mount Sinai, but at Times Square, let's say. God came, revealed himself to millions of people at Times Square, and said that you should follow this Rabbi Greenberg, because he is the one I chose. If I make up that religion, you would look at me and say, you're crazy. If God revealed himself to millions of people at Times Square, how come no one else heard about it until today? You can't make up a religion like that. And that's in the Torah itself. Has anyone ever seen someone claim that God revealed himself to a whole nation. It never happened. There's one exception to that rule. There is a Hindu tradition about one of their deities revealing himself to, I think, millions of people. And that's the claim they had. The only problem is, how do we know that? What happened to those people? They all died. And one person survived. And that person claimed that God came to millions of people. There is no religion, there's no culture that makes the claim that God revealed himself to millions of people, because if anyone would make up that story, it would be contradicted by everyone else who never heard it. That's the only religion that has that claim that God revealed himself to the whole nation. So let's try to understand, what is the purpose of Torah? The master plan. I spoke about this not too long ago, so I'm going to go into it a little bit more depth, I hope. God is a creator. Judaism is a religion of, like any religion, it involves faith. But it's also very logical. Judaism, I know people who were attracted to Judaism because of its mystical nature, because of its otherworldly nature, and some people who were attracted to Judaism because of its rationality. It has both elements in it. So if you think about it rationally, God is a creator. People are creators. We build things. Doesn't it mean that if you build something, especially if you're rational, you'll have a reason why you built it. You have an objective. Why you built whatever you built. So God, the creator of the universe, must have had a purpose why he created it. He has an objective. That's point number one. Point number two, it follows rationally, that if God has a purpose, that purpose would have to have a means for it to be fulfilled. Otherwise, God would be a very bad builder. He builds a building, and the purpose of the building is to have a certain function, and it doesn't work. So God must have had a plan how to make this purpose become a reality. And that means he had to have told the world that he created what its purpose is. Now, obviously, he has to tell people who have intelligence, sentient beings. God cannot just create the world and have a purpose and doesn't tell anybody about the purpose. And God couldn't just impose his will on the world, because then what does he need a world for? Why does he have to impose it? He could have created the world to begin with, that it should be perfect. So God creates an imperfect world, an unfinished world, by design, and he wants us to finish the world, to make it complete, to perfect it. So God had to have told us about his plan. And that's why God creates a human being, a very unusual creature. Some of my best friends are human beings, and they're very strange beings. They're filled with so many contradictions. Human beings, you should meet them. They're incredible. So he creates one specimen. Adam and Eve were originally one body, then he separated them. What was unique about Adam and Eve? That they had free choice. That's what a human being's uniqueness is, as opposed to any other creature. We could choose to do what's right, and we could choose to do what's wrong. We could choose to embrace God's plan, or we could choose to reject it. Not that we should reject it, of course, but we could. Lightning will not come down and zap us when we start to do things that are unholy, that are against God's will. We have that ability to choose right or wrong. And God wanted us to be able to, of our own volition, choose to do what's right, to make the world that God wanted it to be. A world that was pure, a world that was ethical and moral and holy and divinely inspired. God wanted To use the words of the Midrash, God wanted to have a dwelling place in the lowest of realms. That's what this physical world is. It's a world in which there is no truth unless you search for it, unless you struggle to find truth. And God wanted it that in that world where there's no truth, a world of darkness, a world of confusion, we should bring in the light and make the world an ideal and perfect and godly place. So what did God do? He creates a specimen, Adam and Eve. But it's not enough to have one person. You have to have a whole, populate the world with millions of people, billions of people, in order for them to fulfill the purpose. But if God would just give the master plan to Adam and Eve, he had to test them to see if they were capable of transmitting it to the next generation. And they failed the test. What was the test? They were told not to eat the forbidden fruit, which wasn't an apple, by the way. They were told not to eat that fruit, and they could not control their temptation, and they partook of that fruit. So God says, you know what? You failed. I can't trust you. I can't entrust you with the master plan. So God waits until he finds another specimen. The guy's name is Noah. He was a good guy, a righteous guy. The whole world was corrupt, was evil. The whole world was filled with Hamas. That's the Hebrew word for violence, a fitting word to describe a certain group of people. The world was filled with immorality. And Noah, single-handedly, he and his family withstood the pressure from the whole of society and was a moral person. God says, wow, I have someone I can trust. But there's another test. Just because you're a good person doesn't mean you could impact others, that you could influence others, that you could transmit your values to the next generation. So what does God do? He has another test. I want to see how many people could Noah change to influence them to become moral, so they don't have to be destroyed in the flood. How many people did Noah save? Zero. The only ones who were saved were Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. That's it. He couldn't influence anyone. Now, to be fair to Noah, you have to realize that the world was pretty corrupt. And it's like one person will get up in society today and try to change the whole world. They'll look at him as a meshuggah, he's a guy's crazy. Who does he think he is? Well, they thought Noah was crazy. So it's not all his fault, but God says, I can't use him as my progenitor of this nation that will bring the message, the master plan to the world and bring it to fruition. So God waits 10 generations, and then who was born? A man called Abraham, who was then called Abram. And this Abraham, on his own, with his own rationality, discovered that idol worship was nonsense, that there must be a God that transcends creation, who can't be seen or depicted by an idol. He broke his father's idols. Not only did he pass the test, but he also, in the first test, that he withstood the pressures of idolatry to the point that he was willing to die for it. Midrash tells the story that Abraham was caught breaking his father's idols, and he was brought to Nimrod, the king, and Nimrod asked him to bow down, and he refused, and he was thrown into a fiery furnace, and he came out alive. He was willing to die for his beliefs. God says, this is the guy I'm looking for. But could he influence others? And the answer was yes, a resounding yes. Abraham and Sarah, they were a team. So when I say Abraham, it's Abraham and Sarah. They were a team, and they influenced thousands and thousands of people to reject idol worship. He didn't turn them into Hasidim, but they were no longer worshiping idols. He made a major change, and God says, you're the person I'm looking for. That's why he was the first Jew, because he passed both of those tests. And God says, your children, your descendants, will become the chosen people to whom I will entrust the Torah. And God gave Abraham a sample of the Torah, circumcision, which didn't exist before then. And Abraham passed it down to, he had, how many sons did Abraham have? Does anyone know? How many sons did Abraham have?
including the non-Jewish ones?
All his sons, yeah.
7?
No, you're closer. It's 8. He had 8 sons. He had Yishmael, the first son. Then he had Isaac. And then when his wife died, Sarah died, he remarried, and she bore him 6 other sons, and he sent them away to the east. Some people believe that the Brahmins in India are related to Abraham. But anyhow, that's another subject for another time. So Abraham had 8 sons. He succeeded with 1, with Isaac. And God says, your line will pass through Isaac, not the other son. Ishmael, eventually, shaped up, and he was a good guy at the end. And Ishmael was considered to be a righteous person in the end. And many of the rabbis in the Talmud were named after him, Ishmael. And but he's not going to be the one to carry on your legacy. It's going to be Isaac. Now Isaac has 2 sons, Esau, and Jacob. And only Jacob followed in the spiritual pathway of his father. And now Jacob has 12 sons, and they're all following in the footsteps. They weren't perfect. They sold their brother, but they recognized that they had a purpose. And in fact, their argument, which is not the place to go into, was based on interpretation of what was God's plan for them. And they disagreed, Joseph and his brothers. But anyhow, God says, now we have a nuclear family. We have the beginning of a new nation that will accept the master plan. I will give it to them, and they will change the world and bring the world to its intended purpose. But they have to be trained. They have to go through the tests of any nation for it to survive. What are the 2 most difficult things for a nation to survive, a culture to survive? There are 2 tests. One test is, could it withstand persecution, oppression? If you take a culture and you oppress them, you imprison them, you kill their leaders, you ban their practice, that's going to be the end of that culture in most cases. Persecution does have a tremendous effect on taking away people's belief systems. That's what happened throughout history. Religions were wiped out. They say 15,000 religions on record, but where are they? Most of them were just wiped out. But the second test is maybe more difficult than the first test. The allure of assimilation, the enticement of being like everyone else. That's much more powerful a force that makes it difficult for a people to propagate their culture and their religion. So God says, I'm going to put the Jewish family, which would then become a nation, into those 2 areas of conflict. I'm going to put them in Egypt. They will be slaves. They will be oppressed. They will be persecuted. And they're also going to be tempted with assimilation. And you know what happened? After 210 years of slavery in Egypt, the Jewish people, if you have to give them a report card, they got a D-. They got a D-. We're not so proud of how they fared, but they passed. Enough that God says, okay, I thought I would lose this people and have to start all over from scratch. But no, they passed with a D-, and God took them out of Egypt. He plucked them out, even though they were not ready to become a nation. And then God says, I'm giving you the Torah, but you need to prepare for it. And he gave them 7 weeks, 49 days, to purify themselves, so they should have at least a modicum, a minimum of receptivity to the Torah. But because we were really not fully refined, we relapsed. Don't tell anybody, but we're not perfect. We relapsed many times throughout history. Even 40 days after we got the Torah, and God says, don't have any other gods in my presence, what did they do? They create a golden calf and they worship it. Not everyone, but the fact that there were enough people who did it, that was a big stain on our record. So we that's what's beautiful about the Torah. Many people argue, how do we know the Torah is true? Because the Torah doesn't hide the flaws of the people that are the heroes. Yes?
Rabbi, God did one other thing. to prepare the Jews, that he gave them Rosh Kodesh, which allowed them to begin to feel they have their own time and they can think for themselves and their time is theirs and they can prepare and make the future according to what they want.
Yeah, that's part of it, yes. There's a lot of other details here. But what happened over here is that the Jewish people, with all their flaws, were worthy enough and receptive enough that God could entrust the master plan to them, because ultimately they said, we will accept it. That's all God had to hear. There was music to his ears. We said, Nasa v'nishma. Nasa means we will do it, and then we will hear what it's about. Usually if I come to you and I say, I have a proposal for you, a business proposal, do you accept it? You're going to say, 1 second, tell me what it's about. Then I'll tell you if I accept it. The Jews didn't do that. When God came to them, the Jews said, we'll accept it. If you're giving us this proposal, it must be good. And then we'll hear what it's about. And when God heard that, he says, that redeemed them. And he says, I will give them the Torah. So what happened at Mount Sinai, that's when God entrusted the master plan to the world through the Jewish people. And that master plan consisted of two-pronged system. A master plan for the whole universe, for all humanity, and a special master plan for the Jewish people. And in short, the master plan for all society was for them to live a moral and ethical and civilized life, which involved the 7 Noahide commandments, which includes not to kill innocent people, not to steal, and so on and so forth, because God wanted every human being to be part of his master plan. Yes, the Jewish people believe in the concept of a chosen nation, but we also believe everyone was chosen for a basic mission to make the world a civilized world. And what's going on in society today, where public schools have become places where children are being corrupted, not educated, certainly not morally, where parents are being excluded from the education of their children, the moral education of their children. This is the antithesis of what the master plan was about. This is very, very troubling, what's going on in society today. And our mission is to reverse that. But we also have a special mission, a unique mission, and that is to fulfill all of the commandments, the 613 commandments, which involve every aspect of our lives, to make every part of our lives conform with God's will to make the world a godly place. And that's what all of history is devoted to implement this master plan, which leads ultimately to the Messianic age, when the world will become a perfect world, a world of decency, a world of civility, but more importantly, a world of peace and a world of divine expression. We will feel the divine. It won't be God hiding as he is today, because God says, if I'm going to show my face, then you won't have any choice. I want you to choose to embrace me. And then when we do that embracing, every mitzvah, one mitzvah at a time, we will ultimately bring about the Messianic age. Any questions? Yes.
In Saadia Gaon's time, do you think he would have subscribed to your narrow definition of Torah or the broad definition?
They're both right. We use the Torah interchangeably. Sometimes we're referring, when I say take out the Torah, what am I referring to? I'm referring to the Torah scroll and the Ark, which consists of 5 books of Moses. Was it the wrong word to use? No. If I say, let's study Torah, I might be studying with you Rabbi Saadia's work, beliefs and opinions.
Well, would have he considered his work part of Torah?
I think so, yeah. Yes.
Going back about Adam and Eve, you said they had free choice and then they chose to eat from the tree of knowledge. For some reason, maybe I misunderstood something. Free choice preceded the tree of knowledge? Like, you don't need knowledge in order to...
Oh, they had knowledge. They had a lot of knowledge. Their knowledge was on a much higher level. They wanted to get a lower type of knowledge, actually, and that's what brought them down. But they were curious. They were just enticed by the possibility of acquiring a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at things, and they chose to do it.
So who gave them the free choice was part of the initial creation?
That God created human beings with free choice, that we have the ability to rationalize our behavior, to choose to do the wrong thing, and whether it's based on enticement, whether it's based on rational thought, that you are convinced that this is the best thing for you, but we can choose freely. And therefore, when we accomplish something, it has meaning. If an animal chooses to do the right thing, it's part of the animal's instinct. It's created. It's God doing it, essentially. God says, I want you to do it. I don't want you to do it because of me. It reminds me of a story. There was a certain Jew who was becoming closer to Judaism through the influence of the Rebbe. The Rebbe would guide him step by step, tell him, now start doing this mitzvah, now start doing this mitzvah. And there was one mitzvah that the Rebbe didn't tell him to do. And the Rebbe told the person who knew him, he says, I want you to influence him to do that mitzvah, but don't tell him that I said so. And that's what happened. It took months, and he said, I won't do it because the Rebbe never told me to do it. So the Rebbe explained, if I told him to do it, then everything, but I would have been doing it. I would do it anyhow. I don't need him to do it. I don't have to do it through him. I'm doing it myself. I want him to do it because he chose to do it. Yes, he was influenced, but he used his own rationality in his own mind.
Can you just elaborate a little bit between the higher level knowledge and the lower level of knowledge that they got?
Okay, that'll take us.
Okay.
My ignorance. You said that on Sinai, God, that all the people that were there saw his presence. I thought only Moses saw his presence, so where am I wrong?
No, everyone did.
He goes up to get
They all fainted, from the experience, and they asked Moses to go up and get the rest. But the initial revelation was to everyone. And that God summoned Moses onto the mountain, that was also witnessed by everyone. And that's why...
So they heard, so you're saying that God told them, but the God, when he was talking to the group as a whole, he asked Moses to ascend. And they heard that.
Right, after he initially spoke to everyone, people then complained, which is proof that they were Jewish, and Moses was then given the mission to be the one to transmit, the balance, the rest of the material. Okay, we'll take a short break.